You already know the story: a garden, a tree, a serpent that speaks. And the serpent was Satan, the devil in disguise, the first tempter, the cosmic rebel, making his opening move against God and humanity in a single conversation with a woman beside a forbidden tree. That identification is so thoroughly embedded in Western Christianity that most people have stopped noticing it is an identification at all. They treat it as scripture. They treat it as what Genesis says. Genesis does not say it. The Hebrew text of Genesis 3 names a serpent. It gives the serpent no other identity. The being that spoke to Eve in the garden has no name in Genesis, no biography, no cosmic backstory. The name Satan does not appear. The word devil does not appear. The equation between the serpent and a fallen angel is not made in the book that tells the story. A tradition that predates the Christian synthesis made a different identification. It named the being, not the serpent, not Satan, not Lucifer, a watcher, one of the 200 who swore the oath on the summit of Mount Hermon, whose name means God is my helper. His name is Gadreel. And 1 Enoch 69:6 states his crime in a single sentence that later theology rarely knew how to absorb. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who Gadreel is in the Enochic tradition, his position among the Watchers, his specific crime as recorded in 1 Enoch 69:6, and why the tradition holds him responsible for two acts that most theological frameworks treat as entirely unrelated: the deception of Eve and the introduction of warfare into human history. You will understand why the dominant pre-Christian Jewish evidence does not show the serpent equals Satan identification that Christianity later treated as foundational. You will understand the gradual patristic and canonical process by which the Enochic account of Eden ceased to function as a live theological option, and what the dominant synthesis that stabilized in its place required the tradition to assume. And you will be left with one question this script does not resolve: whether Gadreel and the serpent are two traditions pointing at the same event, or two genuinely different accounts of how corruption first entered the world. If the being in Eden was not Satan, if the Enochic tradition names a specific watcher as the agent of the deception, and if the dominant pre-Christian Jewish evidence does not show the identification that Christian theology requires, then the genealogy of evil you inherited is built on an interpretive move rather than a textual fact. The serpent became Satan not because Genesis says so, but because a tradition decided it did. That decision had consequences for how evil is understood, where it originates, and what kind of response it demands. The original text and the tradition that preserved a different answer were both available. One was chosen, the other was set aside. That is not a conspiracy. It is a traceable institutional decision with traceable consequences. And its most personally disruptive consequence touches the load-bearing wall of the entire framework. 1 Enoch 69:6 names Gadreel as the one who led Eve astray. The same verse, in the same breath, says he taught humanity all the instruments of death, the shield, the coat of mail, the sword, and the blows of death. The being who entered the garden and the being who introduced warfare into human history are the same figure in one sentence. The connection between those two acts is not explained in the text. Hold that. If this tradition is right, Eden was not only remembered as the place where disobedience entered the human story, it was remembered as the place where death became organized. Gadreel is named in 1 Enoch 69:6 as the being who led Eve astray. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly who he is among the Watchers, what his specific crime was, as the tradition records it, and why a named answer to the Eden question, one that predates Christianity by centuries, was never incorporated into the framework that most people inherited. The danger of Gadreel is not that he is obscure, it is that he is specific. He appears in a list. That is where you find him first, if you know to look. 1 Enoch, chapters 6 through 10, preserve the account of the Watcher descent. 200 divine beings who swore an oath on the summit of Mount Hermon descended to the earth, and there committed the series of transgressions that the tradition identifies as the origin of human corruption. As established in prior episodes, the leader of that descent was Semyaza. The Watcher responsible for transmitting forbidden celestial knowledge, metalworking, cosmetics, enchantments, was Azazel. The tradition names them, it numbers them. And somewhere in that list, in a passage that runs through the specific crimes of specific Watchers in a specific sequence, it names Gadreel. His name carries an irony that the tradition does not comment on, but the text makes unavoidable. Gadreel, from the Hebrew roots Gadar and El, meaning God is my helper, or God is my wall. The being whose name invokes divine protection. The being whose etymology promises shelter and support from the divine. That is the being the tradition names as the agent of humanity's first and most catastrophic deception. The etymology may not be incidental. In a tradition where names encode theological meaning, where Azazel means the scapegoat or the one who goes away, where Semyaza is often interpreted as carrying a sense of seen or witnessed in the name of God. The name Gadreel functions as its own commentary. The protector corrupts, the helper deceives, the wall that should have stood became the door through which anguish entered. Then comes the verse, 1 Enoch 69, verse 6. Not the serpent, not Satan, not Lucifer, a Watcher named Gadreel. And the third was named Gadreel. He it is who showed the children of men all the blows of death. And he led astray Eve, and showed the shield and the coat of mail, and the sword for slaughter, and all the instruments of death to the children of men. The deception of Eve, and the weapons, both in one verse, one sentence, one named figure. Return now to scholarly register. The text is 1 Enoch 69:6 in the R.H. Charles translation, preserved in full in the Ethiopic canon, the only tradition that carried 1 Enoch as a canonical text through to the present day. The Ethiopic Orthodox Church, alone among the world's Christian communions, regards this book as scripture. For everyone else, it is a significant piece of Second Temple Jewish literature, widely read, cited in the New Testament at Jude 1:14-15, known to Origen and Tertullian, but not canonical. The consequence of that distinction will occupy chapter 4. For now, who is Gadreel among the Watchers? And what distinguishes his crime from the crimes of his companions? Semyaza's transgression was carnal. The taking of human wives, the production of the Nephilim, the violation of the boundary between divine and human biology. Azazel's transgression was epistemic, the transfer of forbidden celestial knowledge to human beings. Metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, the arts of war and adornment that the tradition regards as corrupting gifts. Gadreel's transgression is deceptive, a specific act of misdirection directed at a specific person at a specific moment. 3 distinct modes of transgression, 3 distinct consequences. And Gadreel's crime is the only one among the 3 that maps directly onto the narrative of Genesis 3. This is the point the tradition is making when it names him. The Enochic account of Eden is not a retelling of Genesis 3. It does not reproduce the dialogue, the tree, the fruit, the knowledge. It operates as a parallel tradition, a separate community's answer to the same question that Genesis 3 poses. Who corrupted humanity at the moment of its origins? Genesis answers with a serpent, whose identity it does not supply. First Enoch answers with a named watcher, whose biography, crime, and punishment are all on record. These are not the same answer given twice. They are 2 different answers from 2 different traditions, both preserved in writing. The wider Enochic tradition was known to early Christian writers, but the Gadreel identification did not become part of the doctrinal framework that later Western Christianity inherited. The scholars who have worked most closely with this material, Annette Yoshiko Reed, in her study of fallen angel traditions, James Vanderkam, in his reconstruction of Second Temple Enochic literature, are consistent on this point. The Gadreel identification in 1 Enoch 69:6 is not a commentary on Genesis 3. It is an independent tradition that answers the same question. Its independence is what makes it theologically significant. This is not a gloss on the serpent. This is a different account of what happened. And at the end of 1 Enoch 69:6, after naming Gadreel as the deceiver of Eve, the text says, "He also showed humanity the shield, the coat of mail, the sword, and all the instruments of death, the deception and the weapons," paired in one verse. The connection between them has not yet been addressed. It will be, but not yet. Gadreel is named, his crime is specific, and the tradition that named him predates by centuries the theological synthesis that replaced him with a serpent. But the serpent of Genesis 3 has its own 2,000-year biography, and the identification of that serpent with Satan, though it appears nowhere in the Hebrew text itself, was not made carelessly. It was made by serious theologians working with real canonical material. Understanding why that identification was made and what it required is the only way to understand what was lost when Gadreel was set aside. The serpent of Genesis 3 is the most interpreted figure in the entire biblical tradition. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the Hebrew text actually says about it, and why the identification with Satan, though ancient and theologically serious, is not a reading of Genesis but an import into it. Begin with the case for the identification, because the case is real. Revelation 12:9 names the ancient serpent explicitly as the devil and Satan. Wisdom of Solomon 2:24 states that through the devil's envy, death entered the world, linking the devil to the entry of death in language that gestures clearly toward the Eden narrative. The identification was held by Origen, by Augustine, by Aquinas, theologians whose intellectual reach and rigor are not in question. It was carried through centuries of serious theological argument. It has genuine canonical weight behind it. The reader who holds the serpent equals Satan identification is not holding a fringe position. They are holding a position with deep roots, serious defenders, and substantial scriptural scaffolding in the later canon. That is the truth of it, and it should be named as such before anything else is said. Now read the text. Genesis 3:1. In the Hebrew, the nachash, the word means serpent or snake. It is used without qualification, without cosmic overlay, without any marker that would signal to a reader of the Hebrew text that this creature is anything other than what the word says, a serpent. The text describes it as arum, crafty or subtle, more so than any other creature God had made. That description is important. It says the serpent is a creature God made. It does not say it is a fallen angel in disguise. It does not say it is a cosmic rebel inhabiting an animal's body. It says it is a creature, a made thing, part of the created order that is more crafty than the others. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, renders nachash as ophis, simply serpent. No demonic overlay, no cosmic qualification. The translators of the Septuagint, working in the 3rd century BC, in the same Second Temple period that produced the earliest Enochic literature, did not read cosmic identity into the Genesis serpent. They translated what the text said. Pre-Christian Jewish tradition is equally consistent on this point. In Second Temple Judaism, the figure of Satan operates in the divine court, as a prosecutorial officer, as an adversarial agent with a specific judicial function. The job Satan brings accusations before God. The Zechariah Satan stands in the divine assembly as an accuser. These are texts about a divine office. None of them connect the prosecutorial Satan to the Garden of Eden. The two traditions, the adversarial divine officer and the crafty Eden serpent, were distinct and do not appear to have been merged in pre-Christian Jewish reading. The scholars who have examined this most carefully, including Elaine Pagels in her reconstruction of the origin of Satan as a Christian theological construction, find no stable pre-Christian Jewish merger of these two figures in the surviving literature. The first traceable literary gesture toward the identification is Wisdom of Solomon 2:24, a Jewish text from roughly the 1st century BC or 1st century AD. Through the devil's envy, death entered the world. This is the earliest text that links the devil to the entry of death in language that could be read against the Eden narrative. But even here, the serpent is not named. The identification is implicit rather than stated, and the text is not a commentary on Genesis 3, but a meditation on mortality and righteousness. It is a gesture, not a declaration. Revelation 12:9 is the New Testament consolidation. The ancient serpent identified explicitly as the devil and Satan. This is late 1st century AD, written in apocalyptic code, retrospectively applied to Genesis 3. The identification is now explicit, But the text was written 8 centuries after Genesis, in a different language, in a different literary genre, with a different theological agenda. And its retrospective identification does not change what Genesis 3 says or does not say. The trajectory is traceable. The identification moved from the absence in pre-Christian Jewish reading to an implicit gesture in Wisdom of Solomon, to explicit apocalyptic statement in Revelation, to systematic theological doctrine in Origen and Augustine, across roughly 4 centuries. That is a construction. It is a serious and consequential construction made by serious theologians working with real material. But it is a construction, not a discovery. The Hebrew text of Genesis 3 does not make the identification. It provides the narrative. Later tradition supplied the identity. The Genesis serpent's crime is deception. Its speech is not explained by reference to any indwelling spirit. Its motivations are not given. Its cosmic origin is not supplied. It is conspicuously silent on everything the later tradition needed it to say. Which means the question the text leaves open, who or what the serpent represents, what drove the deception, what the Eden event actually was answered by 2 different traditions simultaneously, in 2 different ways, using 2 different named agents. And the Enochic tradition's answer pairs the deception with something that the Genesis account never mentions at all: the sword. 1 Enoch 69:6 names Gadreel as both the deceiver of Eve and the teacher of weapons. 2 acts in 1 verse, without explanation of the connection. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what that pairing means theologically, and why the tradition that preserved it may have understood the corruption of Eden and the introduction of violence as 2 expressions of the same transgression. This is the pairing named at the opening. We are here. The verse in full, from the R.H. Charles translation. And the third was named Gadreel. He it is who showed the children of men all the blows of death, and he led astray Eve, and showed the shield, and the coat of mail, and the sword for slaughter, and all the instruments of death to the children of men. Read the structure. The deception of Eve is listed between 2 references to the instruments of death. It is not a separate item. It is embedded inside a description of Gadreel's teaching of violence. The shield, the coat of mail, then the leading astray of Eve, then the sword for slaughter, and all the instruments of death. The sequence invites interpretation. In a tradition where compositional choices carry weight, the placement of the Eden Act inside the weapons catalog is at minimum a statement about how this strand of the tradition understood the relationship between the 2. The theological question it raises: why does this tradition connect the deception of Eve with the introduction of warfare? These are not obviously related acts. Genesis 3 contains no weapons. The Watcher tradition in 1 Enoch, chapters 6 through 10, typically assigns the weapons teaching to Azazel. It is Azazel who reveals the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. Yet in 1 Enoch 69:6, Gadreel holds both the Eden deception and the weapons transmission simultaneously. This is either a deliberate theological statement about the relationship between those 2 acts, or a record of how the tradition was synthesizing its material at the time of writing, merging Azazel's weapons, teaching into Gadreel's Eden role, or preserving a strand in which the two were always combined. Both readings are live scholarly positions. John Collins, whose work on Enochic literature and apocalyptic tradition is foundational, notes the presence of variant watcher lists across different sections of 1st Enoch, lists that assign different crimes to different figures depending on the source strand. Philip Alexander's examination of the Enochic literary tradition similarly identifies multiple compositional layers within the Book of Enoch, layers that were assembled over centuries and do not always agree on the specifics of watcher crimes. The assignment of the weapons teaching to Gadreel in chapter 69 may represent one strand of a tradition in which that assignment was fluid. But there is a second interpretive possibility that the text makes available, one that the placement of the Eden Act inside the weapons catalog actively supports. The deception of Eve and the teaching of weapons are, on this reading, two modes of the same transgression: the transfer to humanity of a form of power over life and death that the divine order had withheld. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of mortality, of the boundary between life and death, of what it means to be human in a cosmos with a God, and the sword are two instruments that accomplish the same thing. Both give humanity the ability to act on the boundary between life and death in ways the tradition regards as belonging to the divine prerogative alone. The Enochic tradition on this reading is encoding a theology of corruption in which deception and violence are not separate problems, but twin expressions of a single forbidden transfer, the premature, unsanctioned gift of power over death. This reading has textual support beyond 1st Enoch 69:6. The broader Enochic framework in chapters 6 through 10 consistently treats the watcher transgressions as a collective catastrophe defined by a single principle: the violation of the boundary between divine and human, the transfer of things that belong to one order into the hands of another. Azazel gives humanity the knowledge of metalworking, a divine craft. And the text reads this as corruption, not liberation. Semyaza crosses the biological boundary between divine and human through reproduction. Gadreel, in 69:6, commits both a deceptive act that grants access to forbidden knowledge and a pedagogical act that gives humanity the physical means to kill at scale. Whether these are two separate crimes or two faces of one crime, the tradition places them together, and the placing becomes part of the statement. The Genesis text separates these entirely. Genesis 3 contains no weapons, no warfare, no connection between the Eden event and human violence. The introduction of violence into Genesis comes later: Cain and Abel, Lamech and his sword song, the corruption of the earth before the flood. Genesis sequences these as separate events with separate causes. The Enochic tradition does not. It names one figure in one verse as responsible for both the first deception and the first teaching of weaponry, and it does so without pausing to explain why the connection exists. The text does not resolve which reading is correct. The pairing may be theological statement, it may be compositional synthesis, it may be both simultaneously, a later editorial combination of two traditions that the text treats as unified. because in the worldview that produced it, they were. Present the evidence. Let the viewer hold the tension. What the pairing means regardless of which reading is correct. The Enochic tradition understood the Eden event and the corruption of human culture through violence as part of the same catastrophe, whether by the same agent or through the merging of two accounts into one figure. That is a different account of what happened in Eden than the one Genesis preserves. And it raises a question the cliffhanger now makes explicit. Whether the pairing in 1 Enoch 69:6 is a deliberate theological statement or a textual synthesis, it encodes something Genesis 3 does not. A tradition in which the corruption of Eden and the introduction of warfare belong to the same origin event. What makes this theologically explosive is not the pairing itself, but what it does to the doctrine that was built on the Genesis account alone. The doctrine that made the serpent the singular point of entry for human corruption and erected an entire architecture of sin, atonement, and redemption on that foundation. That architecture had an Enochic answer available to it. It chose not to use it. The moment that choice was made is traceable. The Enochic account of Eden was available to the patristic theologians who built the doctrine of original sin. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the gradual theological and canonical process by which that account ceased to function as a live option, and what the framework that stabilized in its place required the tradition to carry forward. Begin with what the patristic writers actually knew. The Book of Enoch was not a hidden or suppressed text in the early Christian period. Jude 1:14-15, a text inside the New Testament canon, cites 1 Enoch directly, attributing a prophecy to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, defended the Book of Enoch as authentic scripture on the grounds that Noah preserved it through the flood. Origen knew the text. Irenaeus worked with Watcher traditions in his arguments against Gnostic cosmologies. The Enochic literature was not obscure to the people who built the Christian theological framework. It was read, it was cited, and it did not become the framework's foundation. Imagine the problem on the desk of a late antique theologian. One text gives you a serpent, another gives you a watcher. One can be joined to Satan and made part of a single cosmic rebellion with a cosmic opponent who explains the persistence of evil across all human history. The other belongs to a crowded catastrophe of 200 descending beings. Forbidden arts, giants, violence, and flood. Both are powerful. Only one is clean enough to build doctrine on. The specific theological tension Gadreel creates for Augustine's framework requires precision to understand. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, constructed the doctrine of original sin around a concentrated fall. One primal disobedience, one inherited wound, one Adamic point of transmission through which the corruption of the entire human race flows. The serpent-Satan identification helped attach that primal event to a larger cosmic drama, a cosmic agent whose rebellion preceded Eden and whose continued opposition explained the persistence of sin. Gadreel did not serve that function in the same way. Now consider what happens if you introduce Gadreel. Gadreel did not fit that pattern. A bounded watcher imprisoned after his crimes, one transgressor among 200, could not do the same work as Satan in the Augustinian imagination. The Enochic tradition gave him a crowded collective catastrophe. 5 distinct crimes, 200 agents, a named figure in Eden who also taught humanity to make swords. That is a different account of what sin is and how it works. Return to scholarly register. The Enochic framework distributes the origin of evil across multiple agents, committing multiple simultaneous crimes, Simyasa and the carnal transgression, Azazel and the epistemic transgression, Gadreel and the deceptive transgression, other watchers and their specific contributions to the catalogue of corruption. In this framework, the Eden event is not a singular hinge on which all subsequent human history turns. It is one act among many, by one watcher among 200, in a collective catastrophe whose consequences are plural and distributed. This is not compatible with the Augustinian architecture. It does not merely complicate the doctrine of original sin. It describes a different understanding of what sin is and how it enters the world. The serpent equals Satan identification solved a specific problem that the Enochic account could not solve. It gave the Eden event a cosmic agent whose identity connected the garden to the singular narrative of cosmic rebellion, fall, and redemption that Christianity was constructing. Satan, the adversarial figure whose pride preceded the fall, whose rebellion against God established the cosmic opposition that runs through all of human history, could anchor the Eden event to the larger framework. Gadreel, a watcher with a watcher's biography, a watcher's punishment, and a watcher's place in a collective transgression, did not connect to that framework in the same way. The canonical exclusions that followed were not the cause of Gadreel's disappearance from the theological conversation. They were its institutional consolidation. The boundaries of the Jewish scriptural canon developed gradually, and First Enoch did not become part of the rabbinic Hebrew canon. Older scholarship sometimes described this process through the language of a council of Jamnia, but that model is now widely questioned. The discussions at Yavne were real, but a clean, formal council that established the canon in the way earlier accounts described them is not supported by the evidence. What matters here is simpler. By the time Rabbinic Judaism and later Christian canon lists hardened, First Enoch no longer functioned as a shared scriptural authority outside the Ethiopian tradition. In Christian tradition, First Enoch remained known to some early writers. But as canon lists hardened in the 4th century, it was absent from the scriptural boundaries recognized by most churches. The Council of Laodicea in 363 AD is part of that environment. Though the process was broader than any single council, canon formation was gradual, cumulative, and never perfectly uniform. By the time Augustine was writing, the Book of Enoch could survive as a known ancient text, and it did survive intact in Ethiopia, but not as a primary doctrinal authority for Western theology. The Enochic account was not refuted. It was not found to be internally incoherent, or historically unreliable, or theologically untenable. It was set aside. The distinction matters. Refutation requires engagement. Setting aside requires only a decision about what counts as authoritative. The tradition decided Gadreel's name became a footnote in patristic literature rather than a theological foundation. Now the midpoint reframe. What these 4 chapters have assembled is not a catalog of Enochic detail about a figure most people have never heard of. It is the evidence base for a single specific claim. The tradition had a named answer to the Eden question, an answer that predates the Christian synthesis, that is textually specific, that existed within the broader Enochic literature known to early Christian writers. And that answer was not carried forward into the doctrinal framework Western Christianity inherited. The second half of this video asks what the doctrine that was built in its place requires, and what it cannot account for, because the Enochic answer was not part of its foundation. The dominant theological synthesis stabilized around the serpent-Satan reading, not because it was unknown, not because it was refuted, but because it served the architecture of sin, fall, and redemption better than the Enochic Gadreel tradition could. But Gadreel's name has not disappeared. It survived in the Ethiopian canon. It survived in the scholarly record. And the question it carries, whether the being in Eden was the serpent that became Satan, or a watcher named Gadreel, or 2 traditions preserving 2 genuine memories of the same catastrophe, is still open. The text does not close it. 2,000 years of theology has not closed it. And the framework that came to prevail has consequences that the framework it displaced does not. By this point, the easy answer would be to ask which tradition was right. But that may be the wrong question. Gadreel and the serpent are not presented as the same figure. They are 2 answers from 2 traditions to the same question. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what each tradition preserves that the other does not, and why the question of which account is correct dissolves into something more unsettling: the possibility that neither account is complete. Begin with what Genesis preserves that first Enoch does not. Genesis 3 is a story about human interiority. It is a story about desire. The woman sees that the tree is good for food, pleasant to the eyes, desirable for wisdom. She wants it. The man is present and does not refuse. They choose, they eat. They know their nakedness. The severing of their direct relationship with God is the consequence of an act they performed with full awareness of the prohibition. The moral weight of the Genesis fall is carried by the human actors. The serpent is a catalyst, a condition of the choice, but the choice is theirs. The anguish that follows, the exile from the garden, the pain of childbirth and the labor of the ground, all of this flows from a human act committed by human agents in full exercise of their agency. Introduce Gadreel into that structure, and the human moral weight shifts. If the agent of the deception is a supernatural being with a specific biography and a specific agenda, the question of human agency becomes more complicated. Eve was deceived by a watcher, one of 200 divine rebels whose transgressive project predated and enabled the Eden event. How free is a choice made under watcher influence? The Enochic tradition does not answer this question. It does not present the watcher influence as coercive. Eve acts. The text records her action. But the presence of Gadreel as a named agent with a watcher's purpose changes the moral topology of the event in ways that the Augustinian framework could not easily accommodate. What the Enochic account preserves, that Genesis does not: a named responsible party, a cosmic context for the deception, and the connection between the Eden event and the broader catastrophe of Watcher transgression. First, Enoch situates the Eden corruption inside the larger narrative of the Watcher descent. The same collective transgression that produced the Nephilim drew down divine judgment and precipitated the flood. In the Enochic framework, what happened in Eden is not an isolated event. It is part of a cosmic disruption whose scale and consequence extend far beyond a single garden conversation. The deception of Eve and the introduction of warfare, Gadreel's paired crimes in 1 Enoch 69:6, are both part of that larger disruption. These two accounts are not competing for the same theological space. They are answering different questions. Genesis asks what happened to humanity at the moment of its moral formation. How did human beings become the kind of creatures who know the difference between good and evil, who wear clothing, who labor and suffer and die? First, Enoch asks who was responsible for the cosmic disruption of the divine human boundary. Which divine beings crossed the boundary, what they transmitted, and what the consequences of that transmission were. These are different questions with different answers that happen to intersect at the same narrative moment. The intersection produces the appearance of contradiction. The questions themselves are distinct. There is a third reading that should be named here, though this episode is not the place for its full development. Some Gnostic traditions identified the Eden serpent not as a tempter, but as a liberator, the bearer of genuine gnosis against the false prohibition of a lesser creator god, the demiurge. On this reading, the Eden event was not a corruption but a gift. The serpent brought the knowledge that the demiurge withheld, and the fall was a liberation. That is a third answer to the same question, one that reads the Eden event as beneficent rather than catastrophic, and that inverts the entire moral structure of both Genesis and the Enochic tradition simultaneously. The Gnostic Eden will require its own treatment. Seed it here and move on. The scholarly question that the Genesis-Enoch comparison raises, and that neither text resolves, is whether Gadreel and the serpent are the same figure under different names, or genuinely different accounts of different events that the traditions attributed to the same moment. Annette Yoshiko Reed, in her work on fallen angel traditions, argues for the independence of the two accounts. The Enochic tradition is not a commentary on Genesis, but a parallel tradition with its own sources and its own answers. James Vanderkam similarly treats the Enochic Eden as an independent answer to the question of human corruption, not a retelling of Genesis 3 in different vocabulary. On this reading, both accounts are genuine. Genuine in the sense that both preserve something of how their respective communities understood the catastrophe of origins. Neither is complete. Each preserves something the other does not. Two traditions preserve different aspects of the same catastrophe and answer different questions about it, which means neither account is complete on its own, and the canonical framework coming to carry one forward while the other receded was a process that made one question answerable at the cost of making another one disappear. The question that disappeared when Gadreel was set aside is not abstract. It is the question of what exactly was corrupted in Eden, by what mechanism, and what that means for how evil enters the world, not just once, in one garden, but continuously in every generation. The Enochic answer to that question is different from the Augustinian answer. And the difference has consequences that are still present in the theology most people inherited. The doctrine of original sin was built on the Genesis account of Eden, with the serpent equals Satan identification as a load-bearing element. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what introducing the Gadreel identification does to that architecture. Not to dismantle it, but to reveal what it required the tradition to assume and what it cannot account for because of what it set aside. Begin with what the serpent equals Satan reading gives the Augustinian framework. It gives it a singular cosmic agent whose pride and rebellion predate the fall and establish the cosmic opposition, the adversarial will directed against God and against humanity, that runs through all of human history. Satan's rebellion happened before Eden. His entry into the garden is his opening move in the cosmic war. His identification with the serpent connects the Eden event to that larger war and makes the garden the first battleground of a conflict that explains everything that follows. Sin, suffering, death, the need for redemption, the logic of the atonement. The framework is coherent. It is internally consistent. It answers the questions it was designed to answer. Now introduce Gadreel. A watcher is not Satan. A watcher is a divine being who transgressed, one of 200 who swore an oath, descended, and committed the specific crimes the tradition catalogs. Watchers are punished in 1 Enoch. They are bound under the hills of the earth, confined until the day of judgment, stripped of their function and their freedom. They are not continuing adversaries. They are bounded, punished, imprisoned transgressors. The singular devil of the Augustinian framework, the ongoing cosmic opponent whose opposition explains the persistence of sin and the need for continued redemption, is not a watcher. Watchers are neutralized. Satan in the Augustinian framework is not. If the agent in Eden is Gadreel rather than Satan, the Eden event is not the entry point of a singular cosmic rebellion into human history. It is one act among many, by one being among 200, in a collective catastrophe that has already been addressed. The watchers are bound. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are destroyed. The flood cleanses the earth of their corruption, and whose resolution does not require the specific redemptive mechanism that the Augustinian framework builds on the back of the Eden event. This is what the Gadreel identification does to the architecture. It does not merely complicate a detail. It reveals how much weight that hinge was carrying. The serpent equals Satan identification is the mechanism by which the Eden event is connected to the ongoing cosmic conflict that the doctrine of original sin requires. With Gadreel, a bounded and punished watcher, in the garden instead of Satan, an ongoing cosmic adversary. The architecture of sin, persistent corruption, and the need for a singular redemptive act loses one of its load-bearing assumptions. This is not a refutation of the Augustinian framework. The dominant theological synthesis made a coherent choice with the material available to it, within the canonical boundaries that had come to prevail. The serpent equals Satan identification is a serious theological claim with serious canonical support. But the Enochic tradition preserved a different coherent account, one with a different agent, a different mode of transgression, a different understanding of what happened to the Watcher who corrupted Eden, and therefore a different set of consequences for how human anguish and the need for its resolution are understood. The question this episode does not resolve, and that the next full treatment of Augustine will require to examine properly, is what it would mean to take the Enochic account seriously as a theological claim rather than a historical curiosity. That question is not answered here. It is planted here. Gadreel, a watcher whose name means God is my helper, named in 1 Enoch 69:6 as the being who led Eve astray and taught humanity the instruments of death, the shield, the coat of mail, the sword for slaughter, the serpent of Genesis 3, a creature the Hebrew text names Nashash and describes only as more crafty than any other made thing. Its cosmic identity is never supplied. Its motivations are never given. Its connection to any divine rebel is a construction of later interpretation and not a reading of the original text. Jewish tradition, which in the Second Temple period does not appear to have merged the prosecutorial Satan of the divine court with the Eden serpent. The dominant pre-Christian Jewish evidence treats these as distinct figures with distinct roles and no shared narrative. The patristic synthesis, which came to prefer the serpent equals Satan reading, absorbing the Eden event into the singular devil biography the tradition was constructing, making the garden the first move in a cosmic conflict rather than one act in a collective watcher transgression. The Book of Enoch, absent from the rabbinic Hebrew canon and increasingly outside the canonical boundaries recognized by most Christian churches, its specific named answer to the Eden question ceasing to function as a live theological alternative, though the text itself survived intact in Ethiopia. What remains? Two traditions, two answers to the same question, one of them carried forward and one of them set aside. The question the text does not resolve: whether Gadreel and the serpent are two names for the same event, or two genuinely different accounts of the same door. If Gadreel was in the garden, if the Enochic tradition's named answer to the Eden question is taken seriously as a theological claim rather than a literary curiosity, then what happened there is not settled by Genesis 3. It is complicated by it. Two texts from traditions that overlapped and interacted, that shared the same scriptural landscape of Second Temple Judaism, give different answers to the same event. One names a serpent with no cosmic identity. The other names a watcher with a biography, a crime, and a punishment. The two texts do not claim to be correcting each other. There is no moment in 1 Enoch 69:6 where the author says, "The Genesis account was wrong, and here is the truth." There is no moment in Genesis 3 where the Hebrew text addresses the Enochic tradition and sets it aside. They are simply two communities, two memories, two answers preserved in writing, one of which was carried forward and one of which was not. The Christian synthesis chose the serpent and gave it Satan's biography. The Enochic tradition chose Gadreel and gave him the serpent's role. The theological machinery each choice required is different. The consequences for how human anguish originates, persists, and can be addressed are different. And those consequences are still present, embedded in the inherited framework that most people never examine because the question it answers was answered for them before they arrived. The unsettling implication of taking the Enochic account seriously is not that Christianity got the Eden story wrong. It is something stranger than that. It is the possibility that the event, whatever it was, whatever happened at the origin of human corruption, generated multiple independent traditions simultaneously. None of them complete, each of them preserving something the others do not. Two communities, looking at the same catastrophe from different angles, encoding different aspects of it in different literary forms, and arriving at different named answers that cannot be fully harmonized with each other. If that is the case, then the question of who was in the garden does not have a single answer. The text leaves it open. The later framework narrowed it. But the answer that was set aside is still there. In the Ethiopian canon, in the scholarly record, in 1 Enoch 69:6. Waiting in a list of watcher crimes, in a single verse that names a being whose name means God is my helper, who led Eve astray, and who taught humanity to make swords.